Just jobs?
Just skills.
Just transition?
Just Europe.
Welcome to Just Europe, the podcast about building a Europe where no one is left behind. From EU research to local projects, we explore how to ensure a fairer future for everyone as our economies modernise and decarbonise. I'm your host, Katrina Sickle, and today we're talking about the public spaces we share. The streets we walk, the parks where we relax, the squares where we gather. Imagine a city where every child can play safely outside, where elderly neighbours have cool, shady benches to rest on, and where the air is clean, and not just in the wealthiest areas. The United Nations says that this should be a reality by 2030, with global goals for green, inclusive cities. But how do we get there? Streets once dominated by cars are becoming green corridors, pedestrian zones and bike lanes. But here's the challenge. When we design public space, how do we make sure that it's done in a fair way? And how can we ensure that street transformations reduce inequalities rather than reproduce them? Our first speaker joining me in the studio is Karen Vancluysen. She is Secretary-General of the POLIS network, so that's a network of European cities and regions working on sustainable mobility and innovation. And POLIS has helped cities like Porto, Antwerp and Paris become greener, calmer and fairer. So lovely to have you here, Karen.
Happy to be here. Hi, Katrina.
We also have in the studio with us Sarah Stein Lubrano. She's a writer and researcher, and she studies how isolation and shrinking public spaces can fuel political division. She is also head of research at the Future Narratives Lab. A warm welcome to you, Sarah. And what is the Future Narratives Lab?
Yes, it's one of the organizations I work at, and we help usually coalitions interested in progressive issues to reshape narratives about what they care about and think about how we might have a different narrative about the same issue in the future.
Our third guest is Francesco Pila, Professor of Smart and Sustainable Cities at University College Dublin. Now, he coordinates the Reallocate project, a Horizon Europe project where 10 EU mission cities like Barcelona and Bologna are paired to test street redesigns. So effectively, Reallocate is changing how city streets are used, reorganising urban space and mobility. Francesco, very warm welcome to you.
Hi, Katrina. Thank you for having me here.
I'll start with you, if I may, Francesco, because Reallocate works in 15 areas where streets are unsafe or unequal. So what's the most surprising thing you've learned about who benefits and who is left out when cities reallocate space?
As you said at the beginning, we are using a twinning model where basically we are pairing cities and they are learning how to redefine urban mobility from each other. So we have like cities, mission cities like Lyon and Utrecht that share proven blueprints for tactical urbanism with fellow cities across Europe. One of our early findings is that there is a lot of power in redesigning streets from a child perspective. Cities like Warsaw and Lyon, for example, are transforming school surroundings into children's streets. That allow us to bring the local community on board and basically turning these transit corridors into social hubs. Well, we are also keeping a strong eye on social accessibility. So we are working most vulnerable neighborhoods, because we want that just transition.
Karen, from the POLIS network, you work with so many cities, so this must resonate, what you've heard there from Francesco. POLIS describes sustainable mobility as a gateway to inclusion. Could you perhaps flesh that out? What exactly does that mean?
Our cities are going through a paradigm shift because they need to make mobility more sustainable. They need to address negative externalities, which unfortunately come with transport, such as air and noise pollution, congestion, unsafe streets, and climate change. And that's why a couple of years ago we launched the Just Transition Agenda. And we have to make sure that within that transition we don't leave anyone behind. And the challenge is really multifaceted because we need to look at affordability of transport, the overall cost of mobility that that is. We need to look at the physical accessibility of streets, interchanges, vehicles, buildings. We need to look at the availability of services in the first place. If we want people to get out of their cars, there need to be alternatives in place, but also for different target groups, for different moments in time, for different geographies and locations. And we need to look at gender-related mobility patterns, differences and needs, ages, different levels of ability or disability, labor aspect linked to the mobility transition and innovation, for example, and then, of course, the core issue to tackle, and that is forced car ownership and car dependency. So contrary to what is sometimes said, actually, mobility and sustainability are intrinsically linked to inclusivity.
Now, let me turn to Sarah. You've got a book, Don't Talk About Politics, How to Change 21st Century Minds. And in it, the argument is made that democracy depends on what is called third spaces, places like markets or benches where strangers become neighbours. So when those spaces disappear, something clearly happens to a city and its inhabitants. I would also like to pull out what is described as social atrophy. So isolation, the loss of shared spaces, makes people more suspicious and withdrawn. So taking those two elements, how do you see them playing out in cities today?
Well, essentially, we have a lot of data that shows that people are increasingly spending more and more hours of their time alone. And there's also a good amount of evidence around the world that there are fewer and fewer third spaces. So these are spaces that you can go for cheap or very little money, and you interact with people in a non-hierarchical and relatively non-exclusive way. The playground, the park, even certain, aspects of religious life or a pub. And these spaces are shrinking all around the world. And one of the things I write about is this thing called social atrophy. According to the neuroscientists I've interviewed, changes happen where you essentially lose some of your social skills and also your social appetite. You actually want to spend less time with other people, and you become more wary of them. You tend to attribute negative intentions to relatively neutral things that they may have done. This is, of course, more extreme in some people than others, but what it suggests is that if we don't have third spaces that mean that we regularly interact with people and spend more time that is social, if we're not watching, football with people in the pub, but we're instead watching it at home, we're actually going to distrust people more. And obviously that leads to huge political changes in outlook over time, especially at a population level. So I'm very concerned about the shrinking of these third spaces, and we all should be. One of the main reasons is that we've made many of these spaces part or fully private. And it's not very profitable to have a third space, frankly, for the most part. And that means that, everyone from city governments to federal governments have stopped investing in them in the same way and valuing them. And people also, once they stop using something like this, they stop valuing it in the same way. If you don't ever send your kid to the playground anymore, you stop protesting when they shut it down.
Thank you very much. Let us go to a city that is trying to put some of this into action, making sure that we are creating these clean, these green, these socially inclusive cities. Barcelona is actually one of the EU mission cities that's aiming for climate neutrality by 2030. So that's not just about making streets greener, it's redesigning them around its most vulnerable citizens first. Let's have a listen to Irma Ventayol, Director of Services at the Climate Change and Sustainability Office at Barcelona City Council, and also hear from some of the city residents.
In the centre of Barcelona, the Grand Market La Concepció is a striking example of late 19th century modernist architecture. It is the nerve centre of the Eixample district, but in recent years it has also become a climate shelter, a place where, in summer, people can escape the intense heat. This was confirmed by Pili, who has been working as a butcher for some 30 years.
The market is well equipped with air conditioning, so it's always a bit cooler in here than outside. Anything that helps look after the residents, the local community and our customers is brilliant. It's wonderful. We are on the right track.
Spain is on the front line when it comes to the effects of global warming in Europe, with heat waves becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Barcelona City Council has created a network of climate shelters, public buildings such as libraries and community centres, but also gardens and places of worship where residents can come to cool down. Irma Ventayol heads the Climate Change and Sustainability Office at Barcelona City Council.
Empezar a esto en 2019. Hicimos primero como un piloto.
We started in 2019. For the first pilot trial, we had 70 climate shelters. Today, we have 450. In Barcelona, we have the advantage of a vast network of public facilities.
Red de equipamientos públicos muy potentes.
Our aim is therefore to let people know that they can use all these facilities to protect themselves from the heat.
Para resguardarse del calor.
Climate shelters are marked with stickers at the entrance to buildings. Every resident of Barcelona has a shelter within a 5-minute walk of their home. Whilst the project is aimed at everyone, it has been specifically designed for the most vulnerable. The aim is to reduce social inequalities.
In practical terms, the scheme is primarily aimed at people aged 75 and over, pregnant women, children under the age of 5, those in need of care, and anyone experiencing energy poverty in their home.
Local residents had a say in the development of the project through neighbourhood meetings and public forums.
In Ciutat Vella or in the
Prosperidad neighborhood, for example, we ran workshops with women and vulnerable people to find out what they expected from a climate shelter.
But the city council's policy on climate change doesn't stop there. For the past 15 years, Barcelona has been cutting its greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the role of cars and greening its streets. In the Poblenou neighbourhood at lunchtime, young professionals eat lunch at tables set up by the council, where vehicles used to drive. They're surrounded by trees and flowers, which are in abundance this spring after a rainy winter. For Mark and Amelia, both in their 30s, things are moving in the right direction.
All these places where you can cool off sound great to me, especially in July and August. Barcelona is unbearable with all that humidity, so that's brilliant.
It's a big city, so having places where you can really get around on foot without having to worry about traffic or getting exhaust fumes in your face, it's really nice, especially in areas with lots of offices. It lets you get out and take a break from work.
The City Council's roadmap to achieving climate neutrality therefore involves creating green spaces, a task that is by no means straightforward in Barcelona.
En los últimos años hemos crecido 80 hectáreas.
In recent years, we have gained 80 hectares of green space. We still need another 40 hectares by 2030 to reach the target we set ourselves. And then there are other measures. We're using reflective surfacing, we're also installing urban drainage systems, and where we can't create green spaces, we're creating shaded areas.
And to provide shade, some squares are now fitted with pergolas, such as the one opposite the Evangelical Hospital in Barcelona. Eulalia, a pensioner, and her chronically ill son are chatting on a bench.
I think that's brilliant. Anything that helps improve the city is great. Summer is starting earlier and getting hotter and hotter. He cannot stand it.
Indeed, because of my weight, I really struggle in the heat.
But the greening of the streets is also driving up property prices. Barcelona is facing a serious housing crisis. To tackle this, rent controls have been introduced, but the measure is not enough. Nevertheless, there is no question of giving up on pedestrianising the streets, says Emma Ventayal.
We need measures to prevent house prices from rising, but that doesn't mean we should give up on improving public spaces.
As a leading city in the EU Cities Mission, Barcelona is on track to be climate neutral by 2030. As an experimentation hub for green urban planning, Barcelona will carry out a full-scale exercise by 2027 to prepare for extreme heat and temperatures of 50 degrees.
Let me bring in Francesco here, because Reallocate is all about, as you said, peer learning. Barcelona is one of the 10 Reallocate cities. It's twinned with Bologna. Just a couple of things on what you're learning from this partnership.
Barcelona serves as a leader city for the pilots. They are focusing on balancing high-density urban living with inclusive mobility. So we have two key labs in Barcelona. One is all about basically assessing and resolving conflicts between pedestrians, cyclists, and other mobility users like cars and buses in shared spaces. So Barcelona is twinned with Bologna. The partnership between the two cities is centered on a shared vision of reclaiming public space for people. So Bologna focuses more on school district. Barcelona is very strongly focused on a transition to climate neutrality, which leaves no one behind.
Karen, what strikes you about Barcelona's approach, and importantly, how might aspects of it be replicated in other European cities?
Barcelona is a very active POLIS member, and I think what it makes clear, and also the field report that we heard, is that there is really an inherent link between transport planning and land use planning, that they really should go hand in hand. And when people ask me, and it's a question I often get, what the big game changer is going to be in the coming years when it comes to this major paradigm shift in transport, it's not one or the other technology. It really is the massive reallocation of space. We are coming out of decades of car-centric planning, and that's what we need to overcome now, really fairly redistribute that space and favor sustainable modes. We have cities for people and not cities for cars, and that very much also is reflected in the overarching approach to public space that Barcelona has. And at the same time, it also makes clear that if we mainstream services to vulnerable users, and also that applies to transport, and we eliminate barriers from that perspective, it will make the city good for everyone. We need to make our city resistant to shocks, and many shocks are coming our way, and we need to do that in an inclusive way. This reallocation of space is at the heart of what we are doing across European cities.
So, Sarah, let's pick up on something else in this report. We heard about shelters being designed, again, around the most vulnerable, workshops with women and vulnerable people to have their say, to share those spaces. What would you say other cities can learn from this model?
I think there's a lot of things to learn there. What we need to do when we design these shelters is think not just about people, but it's also that they need to think about, is the whole neighborhood coming with them? Are people looking out for each other? Do they know each other? Is the way this design going to mean that people get to know their neighbors more and look out for them? And so we need to bring the whole neighborhood with and make that neighborhood and its social bond stronger.
So we've got the policy, we've got these initiatives, we've got these actions. They obviously translate best on the ground when citizens are brought along and their concerns and their expectations are managed and addressed. So they're very key to the transformation, but getting people on board in practice is not necessarily always straightforward. You need to involve the most vulnerable. They could be using public space differently. The elderly, you've got women and children, migrant communities, people with disabilities, for example. And transformation, change, can, of course, generate resistance from residents, from businesses, perhaps even from entire communities. So let's look at how one can address this. Francesco, again, coming back to Reallocate, it uses digital tools to simulate street changes before they happen. Have you found that this reduces some potential backlash? And did you learn anything else about how to communicate change effectively?
We invested a lot of time in the co-creation process in Reallocate. So we engaged with the local communities in the different pilot areas for over 12 months. We wanted to ensure the intervention were built with the community, not just for them. And so we tried different tools, digital and analog, to engage with the local communities. So we looked at digital twins to show them how the area would look like. We used also analog approaches like geomapping with kids, with children in schools. And what we realized is that if you want to engage with people that they are typically absent from town halls, you need to basically move engagement into their everyday social context. That's what you need to achieve.
Thank you. Let's turn to Karen now from the POLIS network perspective. So many different cities, very different residents. You want to bring them along. What tips or guidance can you offer?
Well, an overarching tool to make sure that you bring citizens and stakeholders on board from day zero, basically, that helps you do that is a sustainable urban mobility plan. It really builds in co-creation, citizens and stakeholder involvements in a systematic way. What we also see really helps to win hearts and minds is piloting and experimentation. When people can experiment or experience in real life how a different city feels like and looks like, that's really powerful. With the pandemic, when we reallocated street space and people could feel what a more quiet city with more cyclists and pedestrians could feel like. And also, good advice, don't be distracted by a loud minority. There might be a much bigger silent majority which actually agrees with what you're trying to do. Use data and unpack false narratives. Just one example, pedestrian zones are not bad for business, and we have the evidence.
Now, let's say that happens, and that's some of the ways in which we can bring people along. But Sarah, in your book, you say minds change through lived experiences and not consultations. So what happens if you've gone through all that, but then the lived experience might become perhaps a little harder for somebody? Let's say a resident who now has to walk, 10 minutes further to reach a bus stop because of a street redesign. How should cities balance that?
So one of the things I read about is that there's a kind of overarching mythos in Western societies that you can give people arguments for things and then they will sort of absorb the right and best argument and then come along for the ride. But in fact, what you find when you look at data about this is people don't do that, and they instead primarily shift their views over time by experiencing them, which is why trial periods can work really well. I do think the other thing is that people, if they think a change is permanent, they often just get on board. But a lot of the most interesting research in my book related to cognitive dissonance theory suggests people get on board with regulation when they think it couldn't possibly be another way.
Can I pick up on that? What political leadership is all about is to strike the right balance between what the city as a whole needs and what individuals want. And that's not necessarily aligned and will not always be aligned. So sometimes you also have to push through a little bit. Resistance to change is always there.
I'm going to take these speakers into a different area now. The green transition, it's also a public health issue. Karen, perhaps you could headline this part of our conversation by walking us through how this intersection between greening the city, public health and justice plays out in practice.
Again, coming back to what I said earlier, unpack false narratives. When we talk about low emission zones or zero emission zones that cities are introducing, which are sticks rather than carrots, very often they say this will harm those in society which are already the most vulnerable because they can't afford a clean car. It's not true because they don't even have a car, but they are living in those areas which are exposed the most to that kind of pollution. And that's why we also see now that the health insurance sector, for example, is investing in research about zero emission zones and how also in the long run it will reduce costs for health because we will have healthier people if we have healthier cities. And coming back to what Francesco mentioned at the beginning, child-friendly planning for cities will also play a role in terms of creating healthier cities also for our future adults, the children of today.
Francesco, the same question to you really. You've got this intersection, greening a city, public health and justice. How do you see that playing out? What would you add?
Most of the time, these green transition measures, whatever they can be, they tend not to reach the least affluent districts in a city. So that's why in Reallocate, we tried in proposal phase to go specifically for the least affluent part of our pilot cities. As an example, just to give you some concrete examples, in Utrecht, we looked at areas characterized by high car density and lower socio-economic status. So we tried to figure out what happened in those areas, because in those areas, most of the time, residents often face higher risk from air pollution and traffic accidents. So what we did is try different ways to safe-proofing this area, specifically school zones, because we have a strong focus on children's safety through tactical urbanism intervention. Because sometimes what you find is that when you tell in these areas that you want to remove a car parking space, there is some sort of a riot. So you have to go for tactical urbanism intervention, so temporary interventions to show them the benefits, and then slowly you transition into permanent intervention when you show them with real-life demonstration that they are effective.
Let's turn to something else here. Such an important part of this, of course, is the evaluation of what works. And at the outset, I said this podcast series explores how to ensure a fairer future for everyone as our economies modernise and decarbonise. So, how do we know whether a transformation at the end has been fair? I'm going to start with you, Sarah. What for you constitutes success, and how should one measure it according to that?
Something I would be really interested in seeing is measurements about how many friends people have and how many people know their neighbours. There's a reasonable amount of evidence that people are knowing fewer and fewer of their neighbours over time. I think that's a very important thing for survival in the 21st century, but also for a happy life. And there's lots of data that shows the more friends you have and the more you see them on a daily basis, the happier you are. So, of course, I'd be worried about elderly people especially, but anyone, I'd say, how many of your neighbours do you know? How many people do you know on this block? And when did you last see them? I think that's a great metric and more important than it looks.
Karen, I can see you were nodding there. What success metrics would you have in mind as POLIS use?
Well, for me, success would be seen on our city streets. For me, the ideal city is a city where children are playing outside, where you have tons of pedestrians walking around, where you have cyclists. So a city for people indeed. And making sure that we also listen to what the citizens tell us. Are they happy? Do they feel healthy? Do they feel at home in a city when they move around? And that you can do through, checking in and co-creation and public involvement systematically through the sustainable urban mobility plans that I was mentioning earlier. But also finally coming back to the data point again, making sure that you also have data from other groups in society which tend to be disadvantaged in terms of how our transport systems have been shaped, and that will be instrumental in measuring whether we are successful. Just a very concrete example, gender disaggregated data, because we know the mobility patterns of women and different types of women are very different from the average white male to which our transport system has been tailored.
Super interesting. I wish I could unpack that in more detail, but I'm actually going to turn to Francesco now, because reallocate tracks displacement and usage patterns. So my question to you is, have you found a city that has reduced inequality through street redesign, and if so, how?
I would just like to echo what Karen was saying. Usually, unfortunately, impacts of intervention on mobility are not assessed properly in terms of impacts on different kind of users. So they don't look at gender, age, and things like that, social demographics. We are trying not just to collect the quantitative data, with digital twins, but we are also trying to understand the lived experience, how people feel the road, how safe they feel they are. And so we are trying to do this with questionnaires, interviews, and see the difference between women, children, old people. And so trying to get also a more holistic understanding of safety and improvement in safety in our pilots.
So we're coming to the end of our discussion. What I would like to ask you is something that comes into play quite often, the 15-minute city model. The idea that everything you need, whether it's work, whether it's school, whether it's healthcare or leisure activities, should be within a 15-minute walk or cycle ride. Sounds ideal. Paris' 15-minute city plan did face protests. There was criticism from different quarters, and even some critics called it eco-totalitarianism. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think essentially it's a very inclusive concept. If you look at what a 15-minute city essentially wants to do, is just make sure that you have good access to services. And that is what inclusion is all about. Of course, not everybody can walk and cycle. And we should also bring public transport in the mix. But that also means that if those people who very well can do those things, walk, cycle, use public transport, and have services within this 15-minute range, it also leaves room for those who cannot use those modes and really still have to turn to the car. Also, we shouldn't limit it to the city alone. We also have to look at the region. We see an increasing urban-regional divide happening. So also look at neighborhoods on a regional scale where these services can be made more accessible. And making services accessible, for me, inherently means being more inclusive.
Thank you very much. Let's close with a one-sentence challenge. What's the one thing that every European city really must do to ensure that the green transition is a fair and inclusive one? Let me come to you first, Sarah.
I would like cities to be more social, and that means that we create equality in terms of people's social connections and not just their material well-being.
What would you say, Francesco?
For me, it's all about engaging with local communities in planning phase, so in designing phase and planning phase before any intervention is deployed.
And you, Karen?
Redistribute space away from the private car.
I thank you all for lighting up this conversation for our listeners. Have you enjoyed it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Real pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you with us. Warm thanks to everyone who tuned in, and of course to Barcelona City Council there. We had that fabulous example. I hope that these exchanges between Karen Vancluysen of the POLIS network, writer and researcher Sarah Stein Lubrano, and Francesco Pilar, Professor of Smart and Sustainable Cities at University College Dublin, have inspired you, the listeners, to find out more, to share your experiences and to spread the word on on why and how social justice can and should be embedded at the heart of a city's clean and green transformation. And of course, there's more great stuff where this has come from in the form of our next episode of Just Europe. So do keep an eye out for that one, as we'd love to have you join us again to learn more about building a Europe where no one is left behind.